What's up, heathens? How ya doing? Today we're going to be talking about Inanna and how that relates with like the Old Testament and a lot of historical things. Namely because I've gotten some heat about my Inanna video and blog post that I posted recently. So I wanted to ask Digital Hammurabi, Megan and Josh about, Inanna and its connections, or the Inanna's connections to everything and whatnot, and really just ask somebody that knows a lot more about it than I do. So, Megan, Josh, you guys want to say hi?
Sure. Hi, I'm Megan. This is Josh. We're both Israelites, and we run the Digital Hammurabi YouTube channel.
Yeah, so if you guys will go over there, subscribe to them, then come right back because we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff that you might want to hear. So if you're interested in that, then please stay tuned. Okay, so first off, how are you guys doing today?
Pretty good, thank you. Happy, relaxed. It's a nice weekend.
Nice, awesome. Yeah, it's a 3-day weekend. We got Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, so everybody likes to call it Columbus Day, but he was kind of a dick, wasn't he?
A little.
Yeah. All right. So today we're talking about Inanna, and I mean, I know that you guys know a lot more extensively than I do about Inanna, the myths, and everything surrounding that particular thing. So I don't know. Do you want to let people know kind of like the backstory or whatnot of Inanna real quick?
Yeah, sure. So Inanna is a Sumerian Mesopotamian goddess who we have attestations from the 4th millennium, 3rd millennium?
Definitely the 3rd. The
3rd, possibly early, late 4th millennium BCE. And Mesopotamia, for those who don't know, is mostly ancient Iraq. So she's a goddess. She's a very important goddess. Originally starts out as the goddess of love, possibly also the grain storage system. And later on in time is syncretized with an Akkadian goddess. Akkad was further to the north, called Ishtar, who was the goddess of warfare, sexuality. So they kind of merge into one deity later on in time. And Ishtar takes on a lot of Inanna's characteristics. They share a large mythological corpus. And they're generally the most important female deities of the region. Very powerful, very scary. If you want shit done, you talk to Ishtar about it.
Okay. And I just to let you guys know, I've already ordered a Y'all Need Inanna shirt. So I wish that I had ordered it sooner so that I could wear it for this particular recording. But, it's not going to get here until the 30th.
Until the day you ordered them. So
okay.
That was my fault. I should have got on it quicker.
Well, the first question that I have to ask you guys is, do you consider Inanna, and I guess the other incantations of Inanna, to be dying and rising gods?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the whole dying rising god category is problematic from an academic standpoint. It's old. It's generally not really in use anymore because the man who came up with it, Joseph Campbell, did a lot of looking at very different disconnected cultures and making broad generalizations across them. And one of the things that he did was come up with this category of God, dying and rising God, by looking at very broad similarities between specific deities, which is a problematic problematic approach to scholarship because it prioritizes similarities and completely ignores distinctions and differences. And it also removes the deities in question from their cultural context. And it's very difficult to really understand really any cultural aspect, including religion, when you take it away from the culture that it inhabits.
To kind of give a little bit of background to this tension in the field, you see it a lot in archaeology, for example. You have individual sites in a particular region, and they have material culture that archaeologists will struggle between interpreting their data and trying to keep, their interpretations very narrow, and fighting against sort of broadly connecting some of the characteristics of that interpretation to, of their material culture at their site to other sites to draw bigger patterns or bigger conclusions. because the further you abstract is probably not the right word, but the more you try to broadly apply a particular finding somewhere else, the more tenuous it gets. But you need to do it because
it's how you form understandings of history and culture.
Yeah.
A good example, though, is if you look at pyramids. There are pyramids in many different cultures, but they are all used for and signify very different things. So the Egyptian pyramids are all royal tombs. The Mesopotamian pyramids are temple platforms used in active worship.
Sometimes they're rockets.
They're never, ever rockets. Ever. No. I need a rolled up newspaper. Just no. Bad Josh. So anyway, sorry. Having said all of that, yes, Inanna does die and she does come back to life. So despite the fact that I don't like the categorization, yes, she dies, she comes back to life. But it's also not a particularly important activity in her cultic life, in her mythological corpus. The myth Inanna's descent is fantastic. It's beautifully written, and it's very widely studied. But she does not. She's not worshipped as a dead goddess. She's not worshipped as a goddess who comes back to life. Maybe looking at Osiris, who his whole thing is that he's dead. That's very important in Egyptian mythology. Even if you look at Dumuzi, also in Sumerian mythology, his death is of monumental importance. One of the main ways that he was worshipped was through mourning rituals. But you don't get that same association with Inanna. So even though in that myth, yes, she definitely dies, she definitely comes back to life, you don't see that association carried forward and spilling over into her ritual aspects, or even when she's mentioned in other texts and in other places, thinking about royal inscriptions or prayers or myths like Inanna and Abik, where she destroys a mountain. She's not considered a deity of the underworld. She's not considered a deity who transverses these liminal spaces between life and death. She's a very powerful goddess. She's a queen. She's the Venus star. She's a warrior and in charge of human sexuality. But she doesn't ever really, that mortuary context doesn't ever really stick to her.
Right. I'm kind of curious, though, with Inanna, and I get that the dying and rising part isn't a central part of the entire faith or whatnot. What would you need in order to make those kind of connections? The fact that she does die and rise, and then we see a lot of other gods that also die and rise. I get that there's a lot of bad scholarship, I'll say in quotes, out there surrounding mythicism and connecting all this stuff together. And so I'm just kind of curious, at what point would it be more of a solid connection? All of these dying and rising things, what would we need to see?
It's a great question. I think, for me, I'd want to look more specifically at the role these gods play within the cultures they come from, see if they're playing a similar role, see if this dying and rising thing is central to their identity, or if, with Inanna, it's more of a peripheral thing. I mentioned Dumuzi earlier, so the Inanna's descent. Inanna goes down to the underworld. She wants to essentially take it over. She is not permitted to. There's already a goddess down there, so Inanna is killed. And then later on in the myth, she's brought back to life. But the goddess of the underworld demands that a substitute be given in her place if she's permitted to go back up to the world. So Inanna's husband, lover, Dumuzi, is sent down instead. He does definitely fit the archetype. It's his death, his rebirth. Well, the rebirth thing is quite difficult because it's rarely attested in the literature.
I mean,
his death is the more crucial aspect, but I would say that is central to him as a deity. So he probably looking at him and looking at other gods where the dying and rising is a central aspect would probably be a better comparison.
Yeah, I mean, we do have some text from Mari that sort of attest to this idea of Dumuzi's dying and rising and the aspects of that. I would almost say that in Inanna's descent, Inanna's death is almost like a plot point that leads to the climax. I mean, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, I guess. But in this context, it's something that it moves the narrative on to her going back and having the Gala demons with her, and approaching different friends of hers or subjects of hers, and oh no, you can't take this one. No, you can't take that one. And then here's Dumuzi, who's in all his regalia. He's sitting on his throne. Clearly
he's
hasn't been
framed.
mourning.
He's definitely been framed.
And it's like
Here you can go.
Bring him.
But what would I didn't think I really answered John's question. What can you think of anything that you would want to see in terms of good scholarship to make those kinds of cross-cultural comparisons?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with what you've said in that it needs to sort of be something like Enki, for example. If you were trying to make a connection between another deity and Enki, not only we would want to see, to be more sure about this sort of thing, we'd want to see interactions. Let's say, for example, in, we know that Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was part of scribal curriculum throughout the ancient Near East. So that sort of connection, knowing that text circulated widely and that it would have been known, that would be something important. And then, Enki is known for his wisdom. He's known for his ability to get out of tight, sticky situations, and he's a bit of a trickster. And so because that's central to him, then if you had another deity where you knew there was some contact, you knew there was, a connection between that, I'm rambling a bit, but a good idea of this is looking at, for example, in the Psalms, Yahweh is called the rider on the clouds. And Baal is called the rider on the clouds. And
that's a really specific, very specific title.
And I haven't done research into that psalm in a long time, but if my memory serves me, which it often doesn't, there in that psalm, there are actually words that appear to be Ugaritic in origin, which, those sorts of things, that's very firm. The book of Kohelet, seeing connections between almost quotes from Gilgamesh. Those types of things are very definitive, making those types of connections.
Looking at the flood narrative is another good one in Genesis and in the Sumerian Akkadian texts. There are flood narratives in many different places. Flooding is a very destructive force. A lot of early human cultures and settlements were in flood zones because that's how farming often best works. You utilize floodwaters. So it's unsurprising that there are several different flood narratives throughout the world. Doesn't mean there was a global flood. It means that flooding was important, so people wrote about it.
I mean, we know there was one, but this isn't necessary evidence for it.
Go and get me a newspaper. I will roll it up and it will be here for when you make.
I can't believe I'm actually looking for something for you to hit me with.
We don't have any newspaper. So anyway, there are those general similarities that are interesting, but don't prove points of contact, really don't prove an awful lot, except people are afraid of floods. But then you look at the Genesis narrative and the Mesopotamian Atrahasis narrative, and there are very, very specific intertextual borrowings.
Plagiarism.
Not plagiarism. Dear God. Thank you. Very specific intertextual borrowings. So you have
trying to give you a lead in so you can say, go watch our video on Digital Hammurabi about plagiarism and intertextuality. I can promote it.
I'm trying.
I was actually
sorry.
No, I was actually gonna suggest everybody go and watch your intertextuality video, because I mean I watched that and I thought it was a very good video.
Oh, thank you.
I was just kidding.
I know, but right, the Genesis and Natural Hypothesis myths, you've got very, very specific examples of borrowing, like the dove going out. And there's what I think in Genesis, it's the order of the birds is reversed, but there are 3 birds sent out, and eventually everything goes back to normal. But the birds specifically are they're not general. Those aren't general similarities. They strongly suggest that the people who wrote the Genesis account were aware of the Simian myth. And because we know there was physical contact between those people groups, that kind of strengthens the argument that actually there is some kind of contact, some kind of similarity. Well, not similarity, but there's contact here, and there are influences at play.
Okay. Now, one of the things that was levied against me that I actually didn't make the case for is that Inanna didn't abandon her throne, like at the very beginning. But when I go back and read it after hearing that, oh, he's wrong about that, I see the first, 5 to 10 verses or something like that. It says that Inanna abandoned all of her different posts.
It's a list of shrines and
it's actually a really common list of shrines.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. Sorry, I don't feel like I let you ask your question.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just gonna ask, like, did she abandon her throne, or is it some other, like, is it being translated as abandoned, or is it like it's not abandoned as we understand it? Is it like a different understanding of abandonment, or like what is the very beginning of the descent talking about?
So the repeated phrase uses the verb shub in Sumerian. Shub generally means to fall or to drop, to cause to fall. But there are definitely contexts in which it's used where it has the idea of leaving something behind. So abandon is why I suspect
it's a reasonable.
Black trades. Do you want to read those lines?
Yeah, sure. So I won't read the whole thing, but my mistress abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the underworld. She abandoned the office of En, abandoned the office of Lagar, descended to the underworld. She abandoned the Eana, she abandoned the Amush Kalamar, she abandoned the Guguna, she abandoned the Eshara. A whole list of temples and like cultic offices that she has a responsibility to that she left.
That's the key, I think. And I say this somewhat off the cuff, so I want to be careful. I'd want to go read all the secondary literature on it. But, the story, you have other examples in Sumerian literary texts where specifically Inanna leaves something behind that she's normally meant to care for. That's under her
purview.
Yeah, it's under her charge. And I feel like charge is an okay way to say that. And so when she leaves these things behind, I think it's sort of drawing the reader to conclude now those things will begin to fall into disrepair, or at least the potential is there for that. So I wrote my dissertation on Sumerian liturgical texts in particular. And one of the things that happens is there's a deity. Oh, sorry. I thought you were looking at me to hit me with something. Mm-mm. There's a deity for every temple in every city. And one of the things that happens is because temples are made out of mud brick in Mesopotamia, mud brick only lasts for 50 years or so. And then it has to be significantly reworked. And when you do that to a deity's home, tear down a wall or something, or tear the whole thing down to rebuild it, that their thought was this has the potential of making the deity angry, and they might leave. And if the god leaves or the goddess leaves,
the city is doomed.
Yeah, you can't have protective deities or deities that are responsible for a particular city or area or person. You can't have them leave, because once they walk away, who's protecting you? Who's taking care of things? And so they would recite these laments, these liturgical texts that would say, here are all the bad things that would happen. It's a story, sort of, all the bad things that would happen if you left Enlil or if you left Inanna. These are the bad things that would happen to our city. And so don't leave because, we're in the shit if you do. So I think that the idea here in the beginning of the Descent of Inanna, while it may not be, again, I'd have to think about it a little more, while it may not be overtly stressed, I think the idea is that she's leaving behind these areas that are under her responsibility to descend down to the netherworld, which fits, I think, pretty well with Inanna. She can sometimes be a little irrational.
Flighty.
A little flighty, yeah. And so I think that's the use being used here of Shub.
And interestingly, that abandoning motif doesn't show up in... So there are two different examples of this particular myth. There's the Descent of Inanna, and then there's the Descent of Ishtar, which is a later composition in a different language. But the Descent of Ishtar doesn't actually have that abandonment. It just says that she went to the netherworld. She didn't leave anything behind specifically. She just went down.
Okay. Interesting. And to me, at least, with what I looked at just in like the New Testament Gospels and everything like that, Inanna leaving her throne to go and do something sounds a lot like what the Gospels talk about with Jesus, at least in my perspective. Because if you look in like the Gospel of John, it has the idea of a pre-existent Messiah figure that was at the beginning of the universe, and then he leaves the right hand of God or whatnot to come down to earth and fulfill certain things. And you also have a lot of I guess scholarly support for Mark also having like the Messiah figure descend upon in the what was it, in the form of a dove or something like that, and then inhabit Jesus or whatnot. Like, I don't know. I see a lot of connection between that idea, just that not that Inanna directly influenced the idea, but I just see like similar ideas being fulfilled in like the Gospels of Jesus. I'm wondering if you guys don't want to comment on it, that's fine. But if you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I would say there's a type of intertextuality that is polemic in nature. I think we see this pretty convincingly in Genesis 1, for example. But the example that we just gave about Yahweh being the rider on the clouds, that's polemic in the sense that it's not that deity that's doing it. It's our deity.
And for different purposes as well. So the going back to the flood, one of the things that you see is it's not Enlil and Enki who are responsible for the flood and the salvation of man. It's Yahweh. And the whole narrative is flipped on its head so that humanity deserves the flood. They deserve to drown. And the thing that is showcased in the end is Yahweh's mercy, which is completely opposed to the Mesopotamian account. So it's taking something pre-existing and reworking it for your own purposes and saying it's not you who is this powerful, it's my God.
I mean, if you think about the way the Atrahasis flood narrative is structured, you've got the gods that are acting incredibly capriciously as they create humanity to so that the lesser gods don't have to do the work. And then they start multiplying, humanity starts multiplying, and they're making too much noise, and Enlil's like, I can't take this. And Enlil gets duped time and again by Enki. Enki subverts his commands, right? So you have a weak, supposed to be powerful, but ends up being very impotent Enlil, who finally gets, his way, gets the, humanity, gets the flood to come, and Enki still subverts him. And at the end, Enlil shows up and sees these people that have been saved and goes, what the hell?
You're all supposed to be dead.
How did this happen? What's going on? So you've got a very capricious but pretty impotent deity. And in the biblical account, we know there's direct connection. I mean, but it's a polemic. It's flipping that story on its head and saying, look, we don't have a capricious doing it because things are too loud and he can't really make things happen. It's a deity that mankind deserves the flood. God, Yahweh actually is very, very patient with mankind and waits until they get to the absolute limit before he says, that's it. I've got to wipe them out, and then orchestrates himself to save a certain righteous remnant, so that he can further his own purposes. I mean, it's taking that text intertextually and flipping it on its head as a polemic. Okay, I say all that to say, I don't see a connection. That being said, if there were a connection, I think it would probably be argued on the polemic side. So, when you look at Philippians 2, for example, Jesus is leaving his position as God. And you see Paul talking about the stages, or whoever wrote Philippians, but the stages of his descent to humanity, being in the equal with God, being the form of God, didn't consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself a servant, right? And humbled himself as a servant to die. And not only a death, but a death on a cross. I mean, these stages, he's going down, 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 down. So that abandonment, if there is a connection, that abandonment, I think, would be polemic in saying,
Inanna abandoned all of her responsibilities, her rightful responsibilities, to go chasing after more power that she didn't deserve, didn't earn, and didn't belong to her.
Very selfishly. Very, very selfishly, I think would be the idea. And in a way that it was all incredibly self-serving and perhaps even irrational. And the abandonment then, again, if there's that connection, I think that the abandonment would have to be then, look how silly these other deities were. Jesus did it, but did it in a way that was not only far more efficacious,
but unselfish.
Right? Not for himself at all. In fact, giving up so much of himself to do it for humanity.
Well, I mean, couldn't that be explained by, how you outlined how the flood narrative kind of got flipped on its head? I mean, it wouldn't the differences just be because it's now a Jewish thing instead of it being the Samaritan, or sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but just this other culture. I was
going to say, I think that's what I mean. If there is a connection, I think that's the way you'd have to argue it, that it is this flipping the idea, that just like the flood did. The thing that I would want to see from an academic, I guess, standpoint would be that chain of continuity. Not that you'd somebody necessarily be able to get that, but see, the reason that we feel very comfortable saying Genesis 6-9 is flipping Atrahasis on its head is because there are other things in the text that very clearly demonstrate that, the writer is writing with Atrahasis in mind.
And again, I'm in no way, because I know that this kind of gets confused, I'm in no way saying that Inanna directly influenced the ideas about Jesus. I was mainly just talking about the whole idea of the deity abandoning the throne or abandoning responsibilities and then descending to to do something for humanity or whatever, or I guess in Inanna's case it was a self-serving kind of thing. But I was mainly just talking about that idea persisting, not that it was directly influenced by Inanna. And so I think that you're right that would the differences would be I guess a key indicator of it. And let's see. Sorry, I was talking and I was trying to think about how to lead into the next one. The next question I got. Okay. So now, in the Descent of Inanna, it has a particular point where Inanna is talking to her assistant or something like that. Talk about once she departs and she starts on her way down to the underworld, you are to go and do these things. And then you finally get to, I forget which one it is. It's like is it Enlil or something like that? Somebody like that.
Enki.
Enki.
Yeah,
it gets to Enki, and then Inanna tells her assistant, like, he will have the water and the something else to revive her, and then he'll come and revive me, or however that happens. Would you consider that either prophecy or foreshadowing at that point, or like what is the purpose of that whole thing as far as the larger context of the descent?
So there's a couple of things at play. First, Mesopotamian literature is very repetitive. You have whole sections just said once. So if I was narrating how I told my son to go to bed, I'd say, talking to Josh, I am going to tell Oliver to go to bed. And then Megan said to Oliver, go to bed. And you get that repeated refrain that
verbatim.
No, absolutely no changes.
It makes me want to weep and then die.
It's great in a translation class, though, because you translate it once and it just comes back 5 times before you're done.
You can look really brilliant by the 5th time it's translated. Yeah, you know what? I'll just do this one on the fly. Don't even worry about it. It's
But so you get these sections that are said and then repeated, and they might be said at the beginning and then repeated at the end, or a bunch of different ways they do it. But repetition is very, very important in Mesopotamian literature. So that's one thing. So having someone say something that will happen and then have that exact thing repeated as action further down is a quite a common literary device. That's not terribly surprising. I would also say that Inanna may be prideful and arrogant, but she is not stupid, and she is going to try and take over Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld, take over her throne and her domain, which is ridiculous. And she knows full well she's probably not going to survive it. So she's anticipating something bad happening, and is giving instructions to her vizier for what he should do when the inevitable happens. I wouldn't necessarily call it prophecy. In terms of literary devices, maybe if it was written in a modern context, we might call that foreshadowing, because it's indicating what will happen. But it's very common in Mesopotamian literature. Do you have anything?
No.
Okay, so the I guess what I'll call foreshadowing, that's common in Mesopotamian literature to like which, I mean, it's a common like storytelling device in general, foreshadowing. So but I guess you're saying that's common like in Mesopotamian literature.
I wouldn't say that foreshadowing is. I would say specifically that the repetition of key sections of text is common, and that when it happens in this manner, something is going to happen, and then later something happens that modern scholarship might refer to it as foreshadowing. But I don't think that this was written to be like a taste of what's to come necessarily.
Yeah, Mesopotamia has the genre of prophecy, and I guess I should think about this some before I comment extensively on it. But I mean, that's a good rule of thumb in general. But I don't think necessarily what's happening here is that she's trying to somehow divinely predict what's going to happen, or that she's looking into the future in the way that we would say prophecy, is, and saying, okay, here's what's going to happen. I think that it's, as Megan said, I think it's probably more likely. Again, this is a literary device, and it's trying to explain why it is that Ninshubor then goes and has these, like, why is it that Ninshubor knows to do these things specifically? Should we read the little section so that people know what we're talking about? Or
Yeah, would that be helpful, John, or no?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, which...
I was just thinking, sorry, I see that you've got it up here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right here, 23 or 28 and following.
28?
Yeah.
Okay. Holy Inanna said to Ninshubor, "Come, my faithful minister of Eanna. I am going to give you instructions. My instructions must be followed. I am going to say something to you. It must be observed. On this day I will descend to the netherworld. When I have arrived in the netherworld, make a lament for me on the ruined mounds. Beat the drum for me in the sanctuary. Make the rounds of the houses of the gods for me." The whole thing? Sorry, I don't know if there's something specific you want to...
And I was just trying to give the people listening, because I doubt anybody knows what...
We can send John. There's a link to a good translation online. We can.
Okay.
Yes, I was just trying to make it so that the audience knew what the hell we were talking about. Do you think everybody knows?
Well, I don't know. I've got my actual video where I discuss this. I read the sections, which I read it from an academic source. I don't know if it's the best translation, but I actually read it from there. So, I mean, I can link people to it if you want. Or, I mean, you guys can continue reading if you want. It's up to you guys.
It's a long section. I'm not sure.
Well, I was just thinking, like when you have entered the Acor, the House of Enlil, the Medfora, and Lo.
Okay, so down to what, 47?
I mean, you don't have to, but like, sorry. If you've already done a video, I'm going to be quiet. I feel like not everybody has an idea what we're talking about, but then if you've done a video on it and your listeners know it already, then you don't have to.
And if they don't, I can just link them to that video, and they can listen to my redneck voice read it. But so in that. So one thing about that particular section, though, is that she goes through all of these different things, and it's like, you're going to go to this house, and if they don't help, then go to this house. But the only one that she really knows has a solution is Enki, or I believe that says, "Oh, you will, he will, come and revive me or whatnot." I'm like, is that still part of that repetition that you guys were talking about?
Yeah, yeah. So she says, I think verbatim exactly the same thing to the three gods that she tells her vizier to go to. I strongly suspect that's purely a literary device, because you get that exact same section of text repeated 3 times.
Yeah, and I think probably the point here is that, again, emphasizing that Enki is the one that the god of wisdom, that he's always got a plan. There's always a way. So I guess for me to think that this is an actual prophecy, I would want to, I don't think that's the intent of the writer, to make this seem like she's prophesying, or I don't think that's being, I think the point here is more as a literary device to set up, okay, you're getting, you reader, you're going to see when I get down there that Ninshubor does these things. Why does she do them? It's because I've instructed her to do them. And
I think I said Ninshubor was a man earlier, didn't I? Not a man.
I don't remember.
Sorry, carry on.
That's okay. Anyway, but it's definitely in the text. If this were like a real life thing, right? And Inanna were saying this before, and we would classify that as prophesying her, her death. And
yeah. Well, I was just going to ask, like, do you think that people, that are familiar with this text coming in later, like say like a couple hundred years or something like that, if they were reading it, do you think that they would understand the intent of the writer, or do you think they would interpret it like how they might understand it? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's difficult to know for certain, but I will say that this literary repetition continues through most, I don't want to say all because I haven't read all Mesopotamian literature, but the vast majority of Mesopotamian literature, regardless of time period, has this same repetitive nature.
In fact, I would say in the Seleucid period, there's a group of texts from Uruk that are liturgical texts and they become so repetitive. I mean, they are liturgical texts. I mean, but they become so unbelievably repetitive that you can almost predict what the next line is going to be. Again, it's a liturgical text, so it's a little bit different. But
I think that it would be. I think that people reading it a couple of hundred years after its composition would recognize and understand the literary style because it was a style still in use in their own writing.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I wanted to know. Now,
Sure.
next, after she goes to the underworld and everything like that, which, I mean, I thought about bringing up the whole crucifixion thing, which is something that I've, pun intended, been crucified over. And, you know, I don't really want to touch on that because I get that that's a real, I guess, touchy position to have, or how I've characterized it. But what I was going to ask is, Inanna is dead in the underworld for at least 3 days, and then mourning rituals begin. One of the criticisms I've gotten is that just because the mourning rituals begin, that doesn't mean that like they were completed the same day and she was risen still on that third day.
On that third day.
What I don't see in the text is like a time frame given. That, you know, you can't say, oh, you know, this took weeks or this took days or something like that to accomplish that. The only time frame that's given is the 3 days. So I'm wondering what you guys think about that. What was the time frame for all of this happening, or is it just sort of indeterminate to know? I guess is my question.
So definitely 3 days and 3 nights before Ninshubor goes and begins this, again, repetitive section of talking to 3 gods in turn and asking for help. You're right, it completely doesn't specify how long that process takes. And I don't know enough about Mesopotamian funerary rites to really say it would have been a week, it would have been a month and a half. And that's even assuming that this is true to what would have happened and isn't a mythological interpretation of actual events.
I mean, you have Gilgamesh mourns over Enkidu for 7 days until the maggot falls out of his nose.
Wait, what?
The death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh is so distraught he refuses to have him buried and sits and mourns him like next to the body until a maggot falls out of the body's nose.
And that's when he realizes
he's dead.
Well, yeah.
We all die.
Wow.
Yeah, we all die.
Yeah.
It's pretty rough.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, I
don't think it's the fact that it's not specified in the text suggests that it wasn't terribly important.
Right.
For some reason, the 3 days and 3 nights is, and I don't know, like numbers have special significance. Often in Mesopotamia, I don't know enough about numbers to say what the significance of that is. But the fact that there is no, on the 8th day, they went down to the underworld and sprinkled the water of life on her says to me that it's not terribly important.
Okay.
But I don't know.
All right. No, that's perfectly fine. And I'm kind of curious, do you think that this in any way kind of relates to like the 3 days that Jesus was supposedly dead? I mean, in Jewish literature, there's several like references to like 3 days in Jewish literature by itself, but I'm kind of curious, you know, do you think that there's any kind of connection, not direct connection or anything like that, but just like a connection between these 3 days that Inanna is in the underworld dead to like other instances of like 3 days in other faiths?
I really want to go do some reading on funerary rites.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, you have Jonah in the belly of the great fish for 3 days.
And the thing is, I don't know if 3 days turns up elsewhere in Mesopotamian ritual. It's possible, but I wouldn't be able to make a strong argument for it.
Okay.
I definitely look at the Hebrew Bible and numbers in there Yeah, but I don't know about if there's even an indirect connection.
Right. Well, and I mean, me personally, I feel like there's much better evidence internally to like the Jewish faith, to connect the 3 days and everything like that. At least for me personally, but I guess I just didn't know like how widespread like the number 3 like was important in this particular context in ancient times or whatnot. So I'm not. I feel like I have to constantly reiterate this, that I'm not trying to connect Inanna directly to Jesus. I'm just looking for, I guess, common points of intersection.
You're looking for the cultural context and if it's a common context or if there's differences. And yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question though, and Josh is right. After we finish talking to you, we're both going to go and look at Mesopotamian funerary rituals.
It's one of the more frustrating things I think about Assyriology is that, with something like Hebrew Bible, you have a very finite corpus, right? You have
the Hebrew Bible.
You have the Hebrew Bible, right? And you have, Ugaritic text, you have Aramaic corpora, but I mean, like, it's a very finite, it's manageable. You can read through, I think it's safe to say you can read through everything. You can't do that anymore in Assyriology. There's just
too much.
You end up having to specialize in one aspect of it. The problem then is because you study the ancient Near East, people assume, not you, but I mean, like, I assume if it's something about Mesopotamia, I should be able to answer it, and that's just not the case. It also has to do with my intellectual level. I think, so.
Yes, that's the problem we're having right now.
No. I completely understand that, and that's why I try to do a lot of research on everything so that I have the best information, which is what I'm trying to do right now. I totally respect you guys' opinions on this, and the fact that you haven't done research into one particular area or not. So it's not like I'm trying to provide any kind of like gotcha points or anything like that.
No, not at all.
Okay, the last question that I have for us to discuss is the connection between I guess Inanna and that particular faith and the Old Testament, because there are a few passages that directly reference the quote unquote Queen of Heaven, and then also Tammuz, talking about the mourning and rites and everything like that. So I'm just kind of curious what you guys know about those connections. Mainly, like it's been thrown into question, like the Queen of Heaven is an ambiguous term and could relate to any number of different goddesses in the ancient world. And so I'm kind of curious what you guys think about that.
So with the time periods we're talking about, it's actually switched from Inanna to Ishtar. Ishtar, very definitely Queen of Heaven. And I'm going to let Josh take this one.
So there are a couple of places that are that come to mind. Ezekiel has a reference kind of early on in one of his times that he's taken around by the Spirit. By the way, if your audience hasn't read through Ezekiel, it's a lot of fun. And you get to see a prophet picked up by the lock of his, like the scruff of his neck almost, and carried
like
around.
A dog?
It's pretty cool. Yeah, it's pretty rough. But at any rate, so here in I don't remember what chapter it's in, but Ezekiel is told like to dig through the wall and to see what's going on in the temple. And one of the things that he sees is women, and they are they're doing the Tammuz ritual. They're mourning for the deity, and the interest in the deity Tammuz, which is the Akkadian development of Dumuzi.
So he's Ishtar's partner, who is taken as her substitute down to the netherworld, and he is a shepherd god, and is later associated with vegetation. So it's been argued that his disappearance, his death into the netherworld, is associated with the dying of the crops.
And we definitely have again, those letters from Mario I was referring to talk about that, at least to some degree. But so when Ezekiel sees this, he sees these women and they're mourning for Tammuz. And what's interesting about it is the passage just before that, I think it's in chapter 8, but just before that talks about how Yahweh won't see what we're doing here. Yahweh's not going to know. And I think that's when he's plowed these, dug through the wall, and he sees what they say, and they're doing things in there that are abominations. They're drawing all kinds of weird shit up on the walls, and they say Yahweh won't see. He has abandoned this place. And it's in this context that you have them doing the mourning rites of Tammuz, who is a deity that, once a year abandons them, right? Abandons the people because of the agricultural aspects of it. So there's been this, idea that perhaps, or maybe it's likely that the reason they're worshiping Tammuz is they're trying to pull in, this sort of I can't think of the word. Take it over. It's not the word though that I'm trying to think of.
Not syncretize.
No, take it over. That's terrible. Anyway,
appropriate.
Appropriate. Thank you. I love MS. It's badass. But it's like they may be trying to appropriate this worship. Of course, the idea here is that they're worshiping other gods in the temple. They're not supposed to be. So I think that's definitely plausible. In Jeremiah, you also have this Queen of Heaven reference. It comes up a couple of times, thinking in the 40s. You see this reference to the Queen of Heaven. And I think that I did a little bit of reading on this. I think it's in the first millennium, you have a lot of syncretism that happens with Ishtar. So you even have the Akkadian word Ishtar meaning just a goddess. It doesn't mean a specific goddess. It just means a goddess. So there's this idea that you have Ishtar of Kish, you have Ishtar of Arbela, you have all these Ishtars. And so it's not that they're necessarily thinking of one specific deity, one specific goddess. That being said, I think that there's probably a good case to be made for seeing the Queen of Heaven as this Ishtar, Astarte, Ashtoret. These you have over the Near East, you have sort of different representations of the goddess Ishtar, and so I think it's probably fair to say that Ishtar is being thought of as the Queen of Heaven here, be it in her Astarte form or in her Astaroth form or whatever. Again, that's a whole separate subsection of research. But I think that because of the syncretism, I think it's probably perfectly reasonable to think that Ishtar is in this syncretized form, is the goddess behind this reference, Queen of Heaven. I think that's reasonable.
So you think that it's reasonable to say that like the Israelites or the Jewish, maybe not all Jews, but maybe like the Jewish rabbis, Jewish elites maybe would at least be familiar with at least Ishtar, but do you think they could be familiar with like Inanna and the other versions of Ishtar?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mesopotamian literature. Sorry, I'll be quiet.
Well, no, I was just.
Here, I found something that you can hit me with if you like.
I'm not going to hit you with a plastic knife.
Josh, you just gave her a knife to stab you with, and it's a dull, like.
So, but it's plastic, so I mean, it would heal quickly.
Like, I'd want to know, and I don't know this, when the latest textual reference to Inanna rather than Ishtar is. If there is still a cultural memory of the goddess under that name in Mesopotamia, because if there isn't one there, then the chances of external Mesopotamian individuals being aware of earlier Inanna seems relatively slim. but I don't have that information, so I don't know.
I do know. I mean, so going back to those Seleucid period liturgical texts, and again, this is a very when you start talking about things like who knew what, it's tough.
Especially because a lot of the religious texts are found in very elite contexts. Who would have had access to them is probably quite a small, narrow list. Like the priests, the king, the elites. Would that have included foreign elites? It maybe, but maybe not.
And the text that, if we're talking about Inanna, then we're talking about Sumerian texts. And of course, Sumerian texts, by at least I would say by 2000 BCE, probably before that, Sumerian's a dead language. It's only being copied in the scribal schools.
So that's even a smaller subset group of people who would have had access to that particular information.
And I mean, during the Ur III period, just before 2000 BCE, people that were copying these texts went on to become like mid-level bureaucrats in the government. So, I mean, you do have a fair amount of people that are familiar with the mythology. But again, we're talking about 2000 BCE. As these texts were copied in scribal schools, it became a very the people that could understand Sumerian, it narrowed, I suppose, greatly. And by the time we talk about these Seleucid period texts, we're talking, so I'm sure everybody knows, but anyways, late first millennium. You have they don't understand the Sumerian terribly well. The grammatical forms change. Like it's almost as if they're copying it like they would copy a religious text, trying to...
The copying is the important part rather than the understanding of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Sumerian still makes some sense, but I mean, it makes sense, but it's very different. And so, yeah, anyway.
So I guess the answer is maybe, but we'd need a lot of evidence.
It's like this
to make that argument.
No, yeah, and I think that I don't think that we can absolutely know a lot about like ancient history, but I think that the fact that it's up in the air is a very honest position. I mean, that's the position that I would take. Just honestly. Can't really tell whether it was or it wasn't. But
I will say, sorry. I mean, I will say this. So Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, I think, is generally understood. I haven't read it in a while, but the research on it. But I think Kohelet is sort of understood to be at least, mid 5th century text, but probably later. Don't anybody quote me on that. I suspect it's later. I don't think it could be any earlier than mid 5th century. And, it's quoting, or it's clearly referencing Gilgamesh. So, I mean, there definitely is interplay, right? I mean, scribal training, there's a book on scribal training in Canaan. That would be, I think, interesting to take a look at in this context. But there's definitely a lot of interplay between these texts. And again, I don't know that you could show a direct link to say Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah is definitely referencing Ishtar, meaning the Ishtar that is the development of Inanna. And so they're definitely, they or even likely thinking about the descent of Inanna in like that. The further you go out with that, the more tenuous I think it gets. But it's definitely not a stretch to say that these stories are known at least in the motif, in the theme, the general theme, and of course in some cases specifically known. So
right.
Sorry.
Well, I know that my entire thought on this particular subject is that these ideas of Inanna, Ishtar, all of those prior myths would have at least had some kind of influence on the Israelites, the Jews, in some kind of way that might possibly have, allowed them to at least know the stories in some kind of context, because the thing that I think is directly related to like Inanna Ishtar is actually the ascension of Isaiah, which I don't know if you guys have really read that or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a early first millennium CE text. Is it a first century text?
Yeah, it's a first century, like Jewish, almost Christian kind of text that, I mean, it very heavily resembles like the Descent of Inanna. And I think that is more likely to be influenced directly by that myth rather than like the gospel stories or like Paul or anything like that. But that's one thing that I didn't communicate well, like when I covered this before, was that I'm not saying that it's like Inanna is not directly influencing.
It's not a direct connection.
Right. I feel like there's a lot of intertextuality to use what you guys were talking about on that video. I think there's a lot of intertextuality between those like myths in that area and what we end up with in the Gospels, at least. And so.
And I mean, you definitely have to factor in that Israel, Judah went into Babylonian captivity, for damn near 70 years. So, I mean, not only are they exposed to it, but I mean, this is something that many of them stayed there. So, I mean, this region is just, it's hard to isolate your literature. It really is. There's a lot of interplay.
Okay.
So
well, complex. And I mean, like I said, I wanted to get you guys on and sort of ask you these questions, which I don't know if they're like really simple questions that, or if they're more in depth or something. I don't know, but I just wanted to ask somebody that would know a lot better than me, sure. About it, and because I'm called crazy all the time, thinking some of these things, or at least that, you're just totally stupid for even, being convinced by any of it. It helps me to know that it's not so much a stretch, like to see the intertextuality that could possibly be going on here. And so it helps me out a lot. And I appreciate that, guys.
I mean, I would say, given the complexity of all of these things, it's obviously very difficult for us to know, and even know that I'm using that in sort of a colloquial sense, but to know what actually influenced people or became the catalyst, or something that motivated someone, or was their basis for writing. And the problem that I would hope all of us would fight against, and not necessarily any of us here in this discussion, but us as well, I guess. And that would be, it's problematic when people start with a conclusion. That's where this becomes problematic. When you start with a conclusion, then you sort of back up into the data. And that's when your conclusion has to be X. It's very easy to have confirmation bias. It's very easy to sort of select your data. A good example of this is something like Daniel chapter 9, where you have this interpretation of Daniel's 70 weeks, and if this is the interpretation, it has to be correct, and it has to end up at a specific year. Then you back into, you look at the data and you say, okay, how do I make this date work with this timeline that I have? And you just kind of stretch it out, and you go, well, this date's kind of close, and this one over here is kind of close. And is there anything going on in this date that, okay, so that one's pretty close. And how can I adjust that, as opposed to, I think that's very poor way of looking at Daniel 9 interpretively, to view those years in that way, trying to see some sort of prophetic sequence of years. But it's that sort of approach. And so I think in this topic in particular, starting with the conclusion leads to a lot of trouble on all sides of this discussion. And so I think it's very wise for all of us. I promise I'll be quiet in a second, but I think it's very wise for all of us to let the data speak, let the data points be, not fighting against them, and then just coming up with an interpretive model and adjusting that interpretive model that accounts for the data points. So
no, I totally agree with that. Because a lot of times what I'll get is like, well, you know, can you show me where it proves this particular point? Like, you know, prove this particular point. And it's like, well, you know, it's not that certain. You know, this is a possible explanation for it. And, you know, there are these things that support that. But then, like, for instance, with this particular discussion, with the Inanna and the intertextuality of it, it's like, well, you know, I'm trying to think of the exact way that it was phrased to me, but it's like, well, like for the 3 days thing, it's like, well, it could have taken so much longer to do it. Therefore, it's not it's not the 3 days that she was dead for. She was dead for much longer because it takes a while for these mourning rituals to happen. And to me, it just seems like people aren't using the information that is actually there, like in the text, or that we actually have. Like, I find that a lot of times people try to read into like the data or try to make up things that just aren't there. And I don't know what am I coming off as coherent in any kind of way?
Oh yeah. I think that when you get into aspects of religion and you're going to, this is just where I see this more recently. This is where I've seen this frequently, which is why it's coming to mind. But you know, you have this broad hermeneutic. You know, the way that you see the Bible, for example, this is where I'm seeing it now. And if you understand the Bible in this way and you interpret it in this way, then, you know, to their credit, they're trying to be consistent with that hermeneutic, which I think is good. But I think it's the wrong hermeneutic. And what they have to do with that is then say, okay, we have these 2 or 3 or 10 or 50 or whatever things that don't work if we use this hermeneutic to come to the text, or they're very problematic. And so it becomes their mission to prove that thing. I won't even say true. I'll just say prove it possible. And that's where things become very problematic. An example that I'm thinking of is Ezekiel 26. I did a video on this, and a lot of the pushback was, isn't it possible that? Is it possible? Sure. Is it plausible given what we know? Not really. And is there an interpretive model that accounts for the data points that we do have in a way that is very likely? And what is it, Occam's razor? Yes, we do have that. But it's only, I feel like I can say that because I don't have this anchor point, which is the Bible has to say this. So I don't have to work around that. I can say, so it's easier for me, I guess. So I can take the data points and shuffle them around. You know, like with this discussion, I don't really care if Jesus existed or not. Like that's not, I know that's terrible, but I don't really care. Whereas I think there are a lot of people that come to it and say, not only did he have to exist, but he had to exist exactly as the Gospels say it, and exactly as Paul said it, and exactly as the early church fathers said it, and any challenge to that, you know, it blows up my world, it blows up my hermeneutic, my interpretive model. And so I have to figure out how Quirinius actually works, you know, and it's like, does that have to work? You know, it really doesn't. But
well, it's funny that you bring that up because I've heard a wide range of different like crazy ideas come from the more religious side of it, because like there are a lot of people that actually move like things around in history so that both Matthew and Luke, their birth narratives coincide and they make sense. Like they'll move Herod's death around, they'll move the census around, and like just for no reason, it seems like no basis like in actual evidence that they do this, but they do it because it has to make like they have to make sense of both Matthew and Luke in order to, I guess, believe in it or something. I don't know. I'm just trying to say that I understand what you mean, what you're talking about. But I really appreciate you guys coming on here and answering my questions today. I feel a lot better, about my Inanna stuff. Not that I'm completely and totally right about everything, but just that I understand it better, because that's ultimately what I want to do. Is I want to be correct in my positions. I think it was Matt Dillahunty that it's like I want to believe more true things and less false things or something like that. Like that's incredibly paraphrased, but like if I'm wrong, I want to know. And so
I want to know about that. Yeah.
So I really appreciate you guys coming on, and I hope that everybody watching will go and subscribe to Digital Hammurabi. Do you guys want to let everybody know like what you're doing over there, where to find you, and like what to expect?
Sure. So it's youtube.com/Digital Hammurabi. Very easy. We're primarily an educational channel. Both Josh and I have extensive training in various ancient languages and history and literature. In case you hadn't noticed from this conversation, we do a lot of that. So our videos are about biblical Hebrew. There are a lot of language classes. We've got a friend working on Middle Egyptian classes for us, which is really helpful. We've got Mesopotamian art videos coming up in the next year. I have more intertextuality videos. Josh at the moment is working on the Book of Daniel and apocryphal literature, which is very interesting, and people seem to be very engaged with that.
Apocalyptic.
What did I say? Apocryphal? Not apocryphal. Apocalyptic. And on top of that, we are launching a kids channel in the new year. So I've been working on getting scripts and recordings for that done.
It's called Anna Mesopotamia. Oh.
No, and I mean, honestly, I can't wait for the rest of your intertextuality videos as well as the Daniel stuff, because I've already watched the Daniel video when you guys aired it, and I really enjoyed that one, and as well as your intertextuality video. By the way, your birds in that were fantastic.
Thank you. For those who are not privy to this particular conversation, I spent a good 40 minutes making sure that some animated birds were as visually accurate as I could get them, and they appeared on screen for probably 5 seconds. So time well spent there.
Yeah. I will say, for anyone interested, I can't believe I'm saying this, but there are lots of people interested. I have a full Sumerian course on the channel. So if you're interested in learning Sumerian, 11 lessons, I'm publishing the book to go along with it now. It's under peer review at the moment. So hopefully those will come back soon. I'm getting ready to also publish a book on slavery in the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. So that'll be coming out. Hopefully that one's on me. I've got to finish editing it. But, and then I started, and I will be continuing shortly, a series, language series on learning biblical Hebrew. So if anybody's interested in that, I think we've got 4 lessons up now. So
including Josh singing the biblical Hebrew alphabet. Oh, and we have a video where he raps the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I love that particular rap, by the way. Oh, and Casey said that she's incredibly interested in learning Sumerian, so I'm guessing she's going to be binge watching those.
Awesome.
Did she say that with her tongue firmly set in her cheek? Or?
Yeah, she has time now since she finished her master's degree.
Nice.
So
congratulations.
Awesome.
Yeah, she's a master systems engineer, Godless engineer. Yeah.
Nice.
Wow.
But anyways, guys, I really appreciate you coming on, taking time out of your day to answer my questions and everything like that. If you're not already subscribed to Digital Hammurabi, go over there right now, subscribe, and they've got obviously a lot of great content that's coming this way, especially with their kids channel launching. So I will definitely be helping them, push that out, letting everybody know about it when they launch that in the new year. So I guess we'll be seeing you guys later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and bye, heathens.